Yesterday, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stood in front of reporters in the lakeside town of Evian-les-Bains and delivered a statement intended to neutralize a growing diplomatic controversy. He confirmed that he is leaving the G7 summit in France without a formal, scheduled bilateral meeting with American President Donald Trump. The one critical audience that Canadian leaders have almost always secured at these international gatherings. The official line from Ottawa is that the Sissing sit-down means absolutely nothing, with Carney insisting that 36 hours of continuous hallway diplomacy and 8 separate informal conversations had already covered everything from artificial intelligence to global trade. That narrative represents a sharp departure from a deeper, why-entrenched diplomatic pattern. Historically, a structured one-on-one between the Canadian Prime Minister and the American President is a mandatory fixture of the G7 framework, designed to reaffirm the world's largest bilateral trading relationship, regardless of the political parties in power. This year, the administrative layout in France shifted entirely, leaving French President Emmanuel Macron as the sole G7 leader to secure a formal bilateral with Trump, a privilege dictated by his status as summit host. While Canada was omitted from the formal schedule, the White House deliberately prioritized individual, structured meetings with non-G7 representatives from Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and India. That structural prioritization signals a tactical reallocation of American diplomatic capital away from traditional continental allies and toward key energy and security partners in the global South. What that shift reveals is a deliberate choice by Washington to alter the leverage dynamics exactly when Canada can least afford it. The timing of this missing audience is highly consequential because the North American Free Trade Pact, which replaced NAFTA back in 2020, faces a mandatory joint review deadline on July 1st. Under the terms of the agreement, a unanimous confirmation by the United States, Canada, and Mexico is required to lock in the trading framework for another 16 years. A failure to reach an absolute consensus by the deadline triggers an automatic transition into a highly unstable cycle of annual reviews stretching out for the better part of a decade. What that framework does structurally introduce a permanent baseline of economic uncertainty that directly targets our long-term corporate investment decisions across North America. The strategic gravity of that deadline becomes clear when looking at the hard mathematical reality of Canadian commerce. Roughly 75% of all Canadian exports are destined for the United States, creating a structural dependency where a single trade disruption can impact entire sectors of the domestic economy. Last week, Trump directly escalated the stakes by stating flat-lie to reporters that he has no intention of renewing the trade pact in its current form, declaring that the original treaty gave him the explicit right to walk away after 6 years if American terms were not met. He stated that the United States does not require what Canada or Mexico produces nearly as much as they require access to the American market, specifically listing automobiles, lumber, and energy as commodities the domestic U.S. economy could easily substitute or produce internally. That economic asymmetric leverage is the actual backdrop against which the Canadian delegation was denied a formal platform to negotiate terms or demand long-term clarity. Behind the scenes, the actual administrative machinery did not stop moving, though it was forced to operate entirely on the periphery of the official summit. Canadian Minister Dominic LeBlanc and Chief Trade Negotiator Janice Charette conducted unannounced meetings with U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer on the sidelines of the event. While the Canadian team characterized these working-level talks as productive, LeBlanc simultaneously acknowledged that Washington is actively pushing to implement a permanent annual review structure, regardless of what is on July 1st. What that response reveals is a coordinated American strategy to keep the bilateral trade relationship in a state of perpetual conditionality, effectively preventing Ottawa from establishing a stable, long-term economic baseline. If the formal stage was empty, the informal one provided a rare window into the raw mechanics of this relationship when an active microphone captured an unscripted exchange at a working lunch. The interaction began when Macron accidentally left his wristwatch on the table, prompting Carney to remark on the open channel that they had possession of the French president's property. Trump immediately responded by telling Carney to give it to him, drawing laughter from surrounding delegates. Within 30 seconds, however, the sequence changed deliberately from humor to hard trade policy, as Carney utilized the open microphone to directly defend Canada's decision to allow a restricted volume of Chinese electric vehicles into the country at a reduced tariff rate. That specific policy decision has been a severe point of friction for the Trump administration, which has repeatedly warned that it will not permit Canada to function as a transshipment hub or a drop-off port for heavily subsidized Chinese industrial goods. On the hot mic, Carney carefully framed the industrial agreement in highly specific metrics designed to appeal to American protectionist logic. He emphasized that Canada had established a strict cap, limiting Chinese electric vehicles to less than 3% of the total Canadian automotive market, which translates to an absolute maximum of 49,000 vehicles annually. Trump's recorded response was simple, stating that he liked the arrangement, which Carney then noted was the third time they had discussed the matter across separate informal windows. That detail tells you exactly how continental diplomacy is currently functioning, with a Canadian Prime Minister forced to execute critical trade defense in stolen 30-second intervals between official summit segments. A hot mic capturing 40 seconds of trade alignment at a lunch table is real, but it remains fundamentally unverifiable and leaves Ottawa in the precarious position of having to publicly characterize an exchange that contains no formal accountability. This pattern of informal access, standing in for structured institutional diplomacy, mirrors a previous encounter at a Middle East peace summit in Egypt earlier this year. During an official address at that event, Trump accidentally referred to Carney as the President of Canada before correcting himself, which later prompted Carney and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer to gently rib the American president, with Carney stating he was glad to receive the political upgrade. While these instances suggest a genuinely cooperative and conversational relationship in private quarters, they simultaneously highlight a profound disconnect between personal rapport and structural reality. The underlying friction points, including the billions of dollars in retaliatory tariffs Canada maintained on American steel, aluminum, and autos since last year, remain entirely unresolved by casual interactions. Canada was one of only 2 nations globally to choose direct economic retaliation over quiet concession following the initial wave of American tariffs, and that aggressive history explains why a formal, structured audience is so critically necessary to break the current legislative deadlock. Politically, Carney is managing this summit outcome from a position of relative domestic stability, which fundamentally alters how the lack of a formal bilateral translates at home. Recent domestic polling indicates his public approval rating is holding consistently between 55 and 65%, driven largely by positive voter perception of his handling of foreign policy and international trade diversification. That domestic insulation gives the Canadian government the necessary political capital to absorb the negative optics of a missed presidential meeting without triggering an immediate crisis of confidence in Parliament. But the more consequential question, the one that the entire North American manufacturing sector is watching with intense strategic scrutiny, was still unanswered. The tension leaving avian Les Bains centers on a critical asymmetry. While the Canadian government frames a missed formal presidential bilateral as a minor procedural detail, it occurs precisely as continental trade stability hangs in the balance. Mark Carney's insistence that informal 40-second encounters over lunch can match the diplomatic weight of a structured, scheduled meeting is about to meet its ultimate structural limit. The administrative reality is that casual rapport cannot rewrite treaty text, and the clock governing North American trade is running out under highly specific, measurable pressures. A clear indicator of this friction is the explicit divergence in how Washington is managing its 2 continental neighbors. While Canada-US trade negotiations have remained stagnant, the United States Trade Representative, Jamieson Greer, has already executed 3 separate formal, bilateral negotiating rounds with Mexican Economy Secretary Marcelo Ebrard, concluding their latest session on June 16th. That sequence is not coincidental. It is a direct policy statement. What that operational contrast reveals is that the Trump administration is deliberately partitioning the trade pact review, prioritizing the southern border, where it can extract faster concessions while intentionally slowing down engagement with Ottawa to maximize its economic leverage. The structural consequence of this stalling tactic is that the three nations will effectively blow past the mandatory review framework originally envisioned for this summer. In a direct address to a Washington think tank, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer confirmed this legislative reality, stating that it is highly unlikely that key sticking points with Canada will be resolved in the immediate term. What that assessment reveals is a deliberate choice not to close a door, but rather to push the timeline into a protracted, multi-year sequence. By ensuring that no trilateral consensus is reached before the July 1st threshold, Washington automatically defaults the trading relationship into a cycle of rolling annual reviews, permanently destabilizing long-term planning for Canadian industries that rely entirely on predictable, duty-free market access. This legislative maneuvering is backed by a broader wave of American trade protectionism that targets specific sectors of the Canadian economy. The Trump administration is currently preparing to deploy new Section 301 forced labor tariffs against 60 global economies on July 24th, a sweeping industrial penalty from which North American trade origin goods are only conditionally exempted. That detail tells you exactly how the White House views the free trade zone, not as an absolute permanent shield for its neighbors, but as a conditional privilege tied to total policy alignment. For Canada, any failure to secure a comprehensive 16-year treaty renewal means its multi-billion-dollar steel, aluminum, and automotive exports remain highly vulnerable to these incoming targeted duties. To counter this economic vulnerability, Ottawa has attempted to build a parallel strategic buffer through European partnerships, a maneuver designed to reduce its overwhelming dependency on the American market. During the preliminary segments of the summit, Carney finalized a new General Security of Information agreement with France and secured a multilateral framework with Germany, Italy, and South Korea to collaboratively stockpile critical minerals, including a technology service pact for lithium refining in Portugal. What that diversification strategy does structurally is attempt to redirect the gravity of Canada's resource sector away from U.S. manufacturing giants and toward European supply chains. However, that pivot represents a long-term infrastructure play that yields no immediate defense against an American administration capable of disrupting 75% of Canadian export revenue next month. The true focus of the impasse has now narrowed down to a single, virtual confrontation that will dictate the immediate future of continental commerce. On July 1st, Canadian Minister Dominic LeBlanc, Mexican Secretary Marcelo Ebrard, and U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer will convene for the first formal trilateral review session to officially table their terms. That specific event will determine whether North America maintains a unified, predictable economic zone or slides into a fragmented system of annual reviews and rolling tariff threats, whether Ottawa can convert its strong domestic political standing into actual diplomatic leverage, will be decided the moment those three officials log into the negotiating grid. Navigating the layers of administrative delays, targeted tariff maneuvers, and unscripted lunchroom diplomacy reveals that the immediate future of continental trade is no longer a question of personal rapport, but of cold structural leverage. The underlying reality of the Evian summit is that the traditional mechanics of North American alignment have been fundamentally altered by an American administration, executing a deliberate strategy of containment. For Canada, the absence of a formal bilateral was not an administrative oversight, but a calculated tactical omission designed to enter the upcoming July 1st trilateral negotiations with maximum psychological and economic leverage. This strategic shift carries profound operational implications for all major international actors involved. For Canada, The current impasse marks the end of an era where continental market access could be taken for granted based on historical proximity. Ottawa is being forced to transition from a position of comfortable dependency into a defensive state of economic diversification, attempting to weaponize its massive critical mineral reserves to secure alternative industrial lifelines in Europe and Asia. However, the immediate math remains unyielding, and Canadian policymakers are realizing that building parallel supply chains with Germany or Italy cannot rapidly absorb the massive industrial shock of losing preferential access to the American market. For the United States, the stalling tactics utilized by the White House represent the practical execution of a highly transactional, mercantilist foreign policy. Washington is explicitly signaling to its trading partners that the world's largest consumer market is no longer open on a permanent, rule-based framework, but is rather a conditional asset to be granted or withheld based on real-time policy concessions. By isolating Canada while simultaneously moving forward with bilateral rounds alongside Mexico and non-G7 energy partners like India and the United Arab Emirates, the administration is successfully fragmenting regional solidarity to negotiate entirely on its own terms. The broader international community is adjusting its own strategic calculations based on this continental fragmentation. Europe and Indo-Pacific nations see Canada's current vulnerability as an unprecedented opening to secure their own resource sovereignty, rapidly stepping into the vacuum to sign multi-billion-dollar extraction agreements for essential battery components and defense technologies. Yet, what that global realignment highlights is a more volatile international system where middle powers can no longer rely on overarching security and trade umbrellas, forcing them to negotiate fragmented, sector-by-sector alliances to protect their national interests. Ultimately, the core insight of this diplomatic standoff is that Washington has successfully shifted the baseline of continental trade from permanent stability to permanent conditionality. The true takeaway from the missing meeting in France is that the American administration no longer views the North American Free Trade Pact as a foundational economic treaty, but as a flexible leverage tool to be continuously adjusted. By pushing the relationship into a rolling cycle of annual reviews and conditional exemptions, the White House has ensured that Ottawa must continuously negotiate for its economic survival in small, stolen windows of access. Continental trade is no longer protected by a permanent legal framework. It has become a continuous transactional trial where access must be perpetually re-earned.